Welcome. This is the start of what I think of as a kind of grand conversation about the intersection of credit ratings and climate impacts, climate adaptation, and climate resilience. It's part of a larger a series of webinars that's occurring. We'll be doing another one soon that's with central bankers in this series. Um, my name is John Matthews. I'm the executive director for AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. I'll come back to the larger initiative that we're representing here in a minute. The run of show today will start off with two keynotes. We'll have Ram Sri with he's a vice president at Moody's Ratings, then moving to Michael Brown, Global Cities lead at the Climate Bonds Initiative, although he has a more complicated background than maybe his title suggests, and then a moderated panel with the two speakers, but also adding Claudia Setoff, who also has a very complicated background with the World Bank, with the CG system. Among others, and Carrie King, who has a utilities background and is now working on institutional resilience with Brown Caldwell. Then final comments with Miriam Seaman, who works on water security issues with GIZ. This larger initiative, it's referred to as Water Resilience for Economic Resilience. It's a diverse set of partners. It's also an open community, and we really hope that you will join it. I'll touch on the core ideas of it in a minute. Next slide, please. The approach, the question that we're trying to address with the Water Resilience for Economic Resilience consortium is how is it that we develop resilience as an economic concept? We have a kind of risk-based approach to thinking about climate impacts. That's important, but resilience is something that it's very difficult for us to be able to place economic value on. In a systemic way, particularly in a quantitative way. And we haven't, as a result, our financial systems at everywhere from a project scale up to a macroeconomic level, high corporate level, it really lacks a an incentive system for thinking about resilience in a more systemic way. And we also, as a kind of secondary concept, have an insight that really is borrowed from the larger resilience community, that water is central to how we think about resilience. Traditionally, we've thought about water as a hazard. We've thought about water as a sector, but water is really becoming understood and known as a medium for resilience itself. So how can we also value this additional and new role for water in the resilient space? We have a report that came out last year with a set of cases and kind of outlined some of the core concepts that you can find at the Linktree link that's listed here. Next slide, please. Just a brief introduction. AGWA is a host for the Water Resilience for Economic Resilience a group and initiative. And I want to provide some very brief opening comments before we turn to our first keynote. And one of the deep tensions that we've seen in the initiative is between risk and resilience. In many cases, resilience has started to become widely used in the finance community by economists, but often what that means in practice is simply reducing climate risks, and that is the approximation for how we look at resilience. The resilience community, like thinking about climate change more broadly, has a fundamentally different understanding of resilience, that it is a positive quality rather than sort of simply reduced risks. And especially if we're thinking about credit ratings, that this tension is actually very visible, that for financial instruments, for financial credit ratings, that may all be all the only component that's really communicated is reduced risk. But for the bodies that need, say, a bond to be able to finance capital investments, resilience is should be core to their operations. They need to actually have this higher internal definition and understanding of what resilience should be. So, is there a way that credit ratings can potentially communicate some aspect of resilience, or is that maybe something that will evolve in time as investors themselves change in their understandings? And if there is a shift in investor understanding, investor appetite for understanding resilience as opposed to reduced risk, will that be a fast or a slow transition that occurs? Next slide, please. A quick example of what I'm talking about is from the fires that are occupying headlines all over the world right now in the greater Los Angeles area in Southern California. And one of the best quotes that I've seen in terms of how to really understand what's happening, like why the fires have been so bad, is that the system that's been set up to fight fires in Los Angeles was designed for a different kind of fire. And this quote from a member of the former head of LA's Department of Water and Power simply stated, if we're fighting a different kind of fire, we have to think about a different kind of system. And climate change, of course, among other kinds of shifts, has led to a different kind of fire that we're living in right now. And we also need to imagine that that fire system may itself be evolving, continuing to evolve in the future. Next slide, please. So while we're thinking, about the tragedy of the loss of lives, of homes, of livelihoods, of places of worship, businesses, we will soon be turning to thinking, what does the future look like? How could we build a new system that might be able to at least address the current world of fires, and perhaps even where the new fires might be? And it's really a discussion about water and water infrastructure. It's new water storage, new distribution networks, and new wildfire fuel reduction programs. In effect, that means massive new investment that has to happen in both infrastructure and capacity. Next slide, please. And that really takes us to the heart of the discussion, I think, today. A new system in that sense really means that LA is also going to be facing a reduced tax base. It's going to have a higher risks of failure to repay loans that it's going to need to take out. It's going to require major changes in city structure and function, and how it thinks about also capital investments. And it also may need to develop new linkages to peer governments, to higher levels of governance, say at a state or federal level, potentially involving the private sector as well, potentially private sources of capital in addition. So a new system simply to address current fire conditions actually looks quite expensive, quite complicated. Whereas even going beyond that to a higher level, to thinking about where fire may be in 10 or 20 years, could be even more challenging. And again, this idea that water resilience in the form of resources and governance and infrastructure is a systemic investment solution, something that we should be thinking about and really trying to encourage as not isolated investments, but kind of water spread across a landscape, spread across institutions, spread across the financial and investment system. I'd like to now introduce our keynote speaker. Ram Sri, we're really honored to have him open up the conversation. He is Vice President, Senior Analyst within Moody's Ratings, Sustainable Finance, and Credit team. He's the lead author of Moody's Umbrella Water Report, titled Credit Effect of Water Management Risks to Rise Amid Higher Demand Climate Change. Ram spearheads the global initiative to integrate water risk and water management considerations into Moody's analysis, ratings, and research. Additionally, he has authored Moody's Global Environmental and Social Risks Heat Maps and the associated framework reports. He holds a master's in management and strategy from Warwick Business School and a Master of Science in Environmental Analytical Chemistry from Warwick University. We're really excited to have you, Ram, and welcome from London. The floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for Agua for the invitation to discuss how Moody's looks at environmental risk, especially water management risk. If we go to the next slide. So this is a very brief agenda on what I want to talk about today. It's at a very high level look at essentially how we look at these risks and how we incorporate into our credit analysis. So first, I want to talk about water management, which is a key environmental risk category for us within our methodology. Then go through very briefly how we incorporate water risk into our analysis. Then touch in about how this analysis then relates to credit quality, and also a little bit on the interplay between physical climate risk and water management, and then finally look at social risk and how water risk, water management can lead to social risk as well. And if we have time, I have some case study that I could quickly go over. So if we go to the next slide, Alex. So one thing that of Moody's being a credit rating agency is that our focus is always on the credit impact and grounded by that rule. What does this analysis show to the credit or the financial materiality? And within our methodology, we have 5 different subcategories for environmental risk, and water management is one of the risks that we think is one of the most important to credit analysis. And I always like to start off kind of grounding myself, thinking as the geological side of when you look at water. When we see water, we see blue planet, which is abundance of water, and we think that's it's an infinite resource. But actually, only 2.5% of the water is actually fresh water that humans can use, and only 1% that is that we could access easily, and even that 1% is not equally distributed around the world. So when I speak to financial professionals or credit analysts, I like to ground myself on just kind of knowing how much water we have, and I'm sure this audience knows that very well. But it's good to just know that it's actually a very finite commodity, and even it's essential for life, it's also a very a commodity which is running out. So that's one of the reasons we think is important to credit, because it's as a commodity. And so why is this so important to our methodology and how we look at water risk? It really depends when we look at the supply and demand side, especially in the last how many decades. On the demand side, if you can look at the top right-hand side, we see that water withdrawals has been growing in line with populations. And actually, this has actually doubled in the last 40 years. So if you can see the chart here, goes from 1980 to 2020, and that's doubled in the last 40 years. And this is mainly withdrawals, mainly because of agriculture, which is about 70% of the withdrawals. Then you have about 15%, which is industries, and the rest municipals. And the demand side, the UN projects that an increase in 30% of water withdrawals from the current levels. And that's really due to a lot of demographic and style trends, such as obviously what we see in growing population, economic development, and consumer preference on what we want, what we like. Even your laptops or your phone right now contain chips which use gallons of water, and that's only going to increase as we see technology go by in the next few years. So that's on the demand side. So now on the supply side, obviously we're seeing climate change, we're seeing continuous drought, and decreasing fresh water availability. I have a lot of facts and figures around my slides. Being a credit analyst, I like to put but also facts and figures. And the UN projects that by 2050, 6 billion people will face water scarcity. So that's a big number. And it's also important to know that when we look at water management as a whole within our category, it's not just on water scarcity. We look on the other scale of water risk as well, which is sea level rising, which is flooding, which we will see in the next few slides as we go along. But it's not all doom and gloom. As John said, there has been a lot of focus, especially in the last year, on water and water risk. One of the poster childs of water risk is Cape Town. Back in 2018, I remember when this happened, we wrote about it, and they were almost about to run out of water, and because of resilience and adaptation measures that were such a focus for them, which just shows that it worked and they were able to mitigate the risk. So that's really a quick introduction, just to base you on where I'm coming from. Again, what we look at is really based on credit and whether it will impact the financial materiality. Can we go to the next slide, please, Alex? Okay, so how do we look at water risk? So we essentially split it into two categories within our methodology. On the top, which I'll be talking about today mostly, is on the water management, and this really focus on the governance of water. So given the amount of water that we have, how is it efficiently used, how is it consumed, the pricing, pollution, and so on. So things like innovation, technologies, groundwater management, and those kind of items would be within this. Again, this really looks to say that water is not an infinite item. It's a finite resource that needs to be managed. And why is that? And that's because of the physical climate risk on the bottom here, which is more focused on extreme weather events. So we're looking at water stress, floods, hurricanes, sea level rising. So these two are two separate categories, but they're very much interrelated. For example, climate change can increase water scarcity, which means there's less water. So water management is a lot more crucial than what it used to be. And another thing which within water management, it's really what we're seeing is an increase in innovative technologies, but also how far along the line are they for it to be effective. When you look at desalination, it's a contentious topic whether it's a lot of energy which needs to be put into that, a lot of emission, and so on and so forth. So really, the role of technology, and maybe that's going to be a lot more bigger in the next decade or so. But so that's really how our methodology looks at water. Is two different ways: water management, which is purely looking at the governance, and then physical climate risk, which looks at how climate risk impacts water management. Can we go to the next slide, Alex? So again, this slide has a pretty busy, a lot of numbers, but let me take you through this. So each year we produce what we call our environmental risk heat maps. We look at all our 90 sectors and look at how exposed they are to environmental risk. One of them being water management, others being physical climate risk, natural capital, waste and pollution, and carbon transition. And this showed that in 2024, our last time we published this, there's almost $2 trillion of debt rated, which have high exposure to water management risk. And 2 trillion is not a small number. It's bigger than the GDPs of many countries. And this is saying that these sectors are highly exposed, and they either need to change business models or they need to do something. Otherwise, the revenue generation or the ability to meet the investments is at risk. So these sectors, as you can see here on the left-hand side, are mostly extractive industries. So you have oil and gas sectors, utilities, you also have agriculture, and you have emerging market governments. You see here it's a mix between what we call public sectors, which is sovereigns, and what we call private sectors, which is companies. So the risk for these two, public and private, are a little bit different. For public, obviously, it could impact the country's economic and political stability. For private, the companies, it's really impacts the operations, whether they could mitigate these effectively. And again, this is as John mentioned, we also look at how well each of the companies mitigate this risk, and these are shown in the future slide, which I'll explain when we look at issue profile scores and so on. Next slide, please. So on the previous slide, I showed you that water management risk is about 2 trillion at the moment. One thing I want to notice is back in 2020, this number was actually 900 million. So within a few years, this is almost doubled. And I can only think of this getting more focus or more attention on this. And there are also a couple of $1 trillion worth of risks which have moderate water management risks. So there's a lot of more focus from investors on these risks. I kind of see water management of what carbon transition was 15 years ago, and it's a lot more focus on that initially, and even as we see more research going on, and as we see more focus on this, this will become something that whether it's companies, whether it's governments, it will become focused on this. And why is that happening? It's because a lot of why is that risk in general? It's because society focuses on certain things, and then governments or regulators or policymakers start taking attention to that, and then that then leads to companies needing to change their business models or needing to focus on this. Otherwise, as I mentioned, their bottom line might be at risk. So this slide here, we created an infographic last year based on World Resources Institute data, and this is projections for water stress for 2030. And also what we put here is certain incidents of different countries, either flooding or water scarcity. And the blue line here you can see is actually the GDP which is being impacted by any kind of water-related activities. So the higher that is, that bar is, the more risk that the country is at a water-related incidents. So this map shows that over a quarter of countries will face water scarcity by 2030, and this number is going to rise to 60% by 2050, according to WRI. That's a huge number, and any kind of sectors which are within these countries have to also pay attention to water scarcity, especially the sectors which have to who have a lot of water in their processes and procedures. And this also goes back to what John was saying. It's really it's a systemic risk. For example, if you have a disruption in agriculture sector, that's going to reduce the productivity, that lead to food shortages and high prices. So this is all linked into water is a very important thing, and it's linked into different sectors and different ways that it can impact economies and sectors. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this very quickly is touching on social risk on water. And what we've seen is most of the social risk is based mostly in emerging markets. And this is a different kind of risk, like access to basic services. So is there adequate clean water for the community? Is the water clean enough for health issues and the quality of life? Again, as I mentioned, food security is really impacting the countries which have most of the GDP focused on agriculture. Also, social unrest. So the right-hand side is a graph by the Pacific Institute Water Conflict Chronology. It looks at how over the time water has been used either in a trigger conflict or casualty, which is quite interesting. Which it shows obviously a trend upwards, but it shows that water has become such an important commodity that it's been used whether in wars or whether in conflicts. And again, comes back to how it's so inbuilt within every kind of sector, within either different countries or different areas within sectors. So it comes back to how resilience, adaptation is very important to kind of mitigate these risks. So that's all comments I had. I have two case studies I could quickly look at if we have time, John. Do you want me to go through that very quickly?
That would be great. Yeah, you've got plenty of time, Ram.
Okay. Next slide, please. So Singapore is one of the case studies I'm look at. Singapore is one of the most water stressed countries according to WRI. It hasn't got any natural aquifers. It's a very low-lying country, and it's a very small country. But it's done excellent job in mitigation strategy and increasing resilience. And these are essentially very high level on what they've done. They've diversified their water strategy, as you can see in the top left. So they're not, focused on one area to, feed the population. They also have water conservation mindset within the population, and the government implement various different strategies. I think one of the problems is, we think that water is a finite, infinite commodity, and we think that it could always be like this forever. And it obviously provides, we see in other countries where they're shipping water from afar to essentially feed crops in very dry areas. So I think what the governments what they've done is they've really implemented the mentality of water conservation at the population level, and they also have something called new water. Again, they're spending a lot of money on different technologies, different new ways they could get fresh water. So Singapore is a very common example which has been used all the time. Other ones are Israel and other countries which are inherently are very exposed to water risk, water stress, but because of mitigation resilience, they've really managed to really excel in their resilience. If you go next slide, please. Thanks. And then we have this is a regional focus on Middle East and North Africa. Again, inherently, there's a lot of water risk around these areas, and due to many different factors from rapid population growth, urbanization, but also just looking, they don't have much fresh water within these regions. And we've wrote a paper on this, which I could send to John and Alex. You can link to any kind of advice that you have. But we looked at the credit and economic constraints the water has within these sectors. The government has to decide whether they want to spend money, the fiscal budget, on new water innovative technologies or on other items that it could really weigh in the economy. And again, the other factors like social and political risk. This is really the population not getting enough water or not getting enough food because of water. And this has really impacted low economy sovereigns. There's some examples here. But the high income sovereigns are able to manage this risk, and take away any kind of negative effects. But again, there needs to be a resilience built into even for the high income countries into looking at water and water risk because of its finite nature. And just quickly put down some mitigation strategies. Again, desalination, water reuse, institute strength. We've written about this in detail in the research. I'm happy to send a link to John and Alex who could provide you. So that's all really my prepared comments. This is a very high level on something which is a huge topic, but I think hopefully that gave you an idea of how we look at water risk, water stress. And again, for us, it's really to focus on credit and whether the credit materiality is there. Otherwise, it's something that which is really interesting, but it's something that might not matter to us. But water management is one of 5 pillars in our methodology. It's a very important risk that we look at, and it's only getting more important as water scarcity and climate change exacerbate water risk. So John, over to you. That's all the prepared comments I had. I don't know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them.
That was fantastic, Ram. I was really struck by a number of comments that you're making. I love the the idea of really viewing water as a systemic risk. But also, I think particularly in your case studies, you really highlighted water as this systemic solution too. And the story I think of Singapore is maybe to make that example even more piquant. If we look back at, say, the end of World War II, or even in the maybe as recently as the early 1950s, um, Singapore was one of the poorest countries in the world, uh, and their development strategy was really around water development and recognizing those kind of that, like where your conversation started, that actually the kind of missing resources in the country were water, and being able to build on that, and look where they are now. They're one of the wealthiest parts of the planet.
Yeah,
That transformation, I think, probably goes to the heart of what your research is really trying to drive and to encourage and to build on. And I think that's a very powerful form of financial communication. And I also, maybe as a last reflection before we turn to our next keynote, is I was also very impressed. I mean, I think what I saw demonstrated was that you were really trying to use your tools within Moody's as a form of communication, to think about strategy more broadly, and what are the right kinds of investments, the right categories, and how that's changed over time. Your comment that where water is now is probably where carbon was a decade or more ago. As also suggests that there's a kind of growth path in our understanding headed over the next decade that we need to be on. So all really critical and useful points. Well, I'm really looking forward to your comments on the panel too. I'd like to now turn to a colleague, and also a friend, Mike Brown. Mike is he currently is the city's global cities lead at the Climate Bonds Initiative, where he supports governments in identifying eligible projects and securing funding to achieve climate and resilience goals. Since joining CBI in 2022, he has led capacity building workshops and developed innovative financing solutions for cities worldwide. Prior to CBI, Mike spent 16 years at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission as environmental finance manager, where he oversaw the issuance of over $3 billion in certified green bonds under the climate bonds water criteria, which I will throw in. He was instrumental in helping to develop. There was something that we collaborated on. Mike holds a master's in urban studies and planning from MIT, and is committed to advancing sustainable finance to support climate resilient infrastructure. The floor is yours, Mike.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks for including me on this panel. Um, uh, this is a super interesting and timely topic. Of course, it's with what's been happening in Southern California. I want to just to give you a kind of an idea what I want to do for the next 15 minutes or so is just talk about what I think is sort of just describe the problem, the fact that resilience isn't adequately reflected in credit ratings or other kinds of credit evaluations like that an investor or insurance company might do. Then speak about some of the effects of that, and then finally what we can do going forward to help address this problem. Okay. So as I just said, so we're in a situation where the market isn't adequately measuring or reflecting resilience. And it will be interesting maybe in the panel we can talk more to Ram about how Moody's, what percentage of a rating has to do with financial performance versus what percentage of the rating has to do with climate vulnerabilities, specifically in the water sector. So we know, intuitively that if you're making investments in resilience, that should reduce an entity's vulnerability and make the entity more likely to be able to repay its debt. and less likely to default. And that's fundamentally what a rating is supposed to measure, the likelihood of default. So if you're making these investments and making these entities more resilient, it should be reflected in a credit rating. And I will say, when I was at San Francisco, the city's work on sea level rise was reflected in a Moody's report. So there, and I know in another city in New York State, a similar thing happened. So I know perhaps this is emerging where, and maybe it's happening more than I'm even aware, but that credit rating agencies are reflecting efforts to make the issuer more resilient and factoring that into their score. Um, I'll say that the connection is not well integrated into credit ratings. I was saying the problem is also happening with issuers and utilities themselves. They're not getting the kind of correct signal that they or cover perhaps that they should be thinking long term about their capital investments. Which, if you're investing in resilience, that may require additional expense, additional studies to be done, et cetera. And I think um, there isn't always the political will to do that. And we can talk about with my old colleague Carrie about that on the panel as well. And then this is also an issue with the investor credit review. So are they just looking at the likelihood of default as well, or are they asking to see information about resilience and efforts to make the issuer less vulnerable to climate shocks? And then there's insurance. Insurance has actually tons of great data and modeling, but they are very short term in their thinking because they can obviously drop a policy after a year or depending on what the conditions are. So that they do, as far as I know, they rely a lot on credit ratings to make their assessments long term. Um, and as I start off by saying, current credit assessments are very focused on financial performance, which makes sense, and that's really been sort of the main function of credit rating agencies, at least, until very recently. I think now that we're experiencing these climate risks actually on the ground, especially at the local government level, it's going to become more and more of a focus. Another sort of challenge, I think, with resilience and adaptation, say compared to mitigation, is that resilience is often very hard to measure. It's often the counterfactual, and we're talking about long-term benefits, that would result from investing in resiliency. Whereas, with mitigation, we know how many passengers or sort of miles avoided or emissions avoided, that kind of thing. It's much easier to quantify with mitigation efforts. I will say that tools and methodologies to measure resilience and adaptation, the benefits of adaptation, are emerging. And I'll talk about a couple later in this presentation. I also want to point out something that that is impacting this problem, is that there's the time horizons which with the different stakeholders are looking at these investments varies. So if you're an issuer, if you're a water utility, you are obviously looking at the life of the asset, so that's 30 years or more. A rating agency may only be looking 5 years. And this is a question for Ron we can get back to later. I know the rating agencies have been acquiring climate data firms, so maybe they're going out longer in their outlook. But at least as a couple of years ago, it was pretty short, because they would argue, and you couldn't really fault them, that they really didn't have the data to go out too far to be able to predict the likelihood of an event. Like, it would have been very, very difficult to predict what's been happening in LA right now. It was one of the worst case scenarios that was modeled, but the chances of that happening were quite small. And then investors, obviously they do prioritize short-term returns, but they need to be able to get out of the investment if they need to, and they don't want to lose money. So they do have also a very strong vested interest in these projects meeting their useful life and the issuer's ability to repay the debt. Many investors, including insurance companies, actually in the US anyway, with 30-year bonds, are some of the largest investors in 30-year muni bonds. So there's an alignment of interest there. And insurers, many cities I think are self-insured, but for those cities that are using insurance companies, insurance companies probably do have excellent data, but they are looking at, as I understand it, very short term as well. And of course, they can exit a policy if they want to, or exit a state or a region, as they're starting to do. In California, my homeowners insurance providers just about 6 months ago told me that they were leaving the state. So it's definitely happening. We know that there's a tremendous risk due to inaction. So these are some of the problems caused by resilience not being adequately measured. These are just some estimates, 200 billion in annual losses related to climate disasters from the World Bank. Proactive investment could save up to 7 trillion. This is obviously a huge number. The OECD has calculated a resilience dividend for every $1 invested, $4 in avoided costs. And then I just learned last night that S&P downgraded LA Department of Water and Power from AA minus to AA. And it's difficult to precisely estimate what that impact will be on their borrowing costs, but roughly, and we can let Ram comment on this, it could be 20 to 40 basis points, so 1/5 or more of a percent. And when you're borrowing billions and billions of dollars, which will be required post disaster, that's hundreds of millions of dollars of extra costs that are going to accrue to the ratepayers of LA. And in that context, I wonder if that resilience dividend is way too conservative, that the OECD's claimed. And then I just have a comment here that the future risk and worst case scenarios that we were planning for seem to be here now. And I know there was a study done about 5 years ago about these sort of worst case scenario fires that could happen in the state of California, and 2 or 3 were in Northern California and a couple in Southern California, and the Palisades was one of them they cited. And we definitely had this sort of perfect storm of high winds, which both made the fire worse, but also prevented airplanes and helicopters from fighting the fire. There were water tanks that were depleted very quickly, but going back to John's comment, what kind of fire were these water tanks designed for? Obviously not this kind of fire. So we need, I don't want to pick on LA or anything, but it's like of course, it's not the point here, but just thinking about like, what are we designing this infrastructure for? It seems like it may not be designed appropriately anymore. Some things we can do as issuers, rating agencies, investors, insurers, is, obviously is assess and be transparent about the risks. Try to measure resilience, the benefits of resilience whenever possible. And I wrote here that stakeholders can support this. So definitely when I was in San Francisco, S&P and Moody's, they would ask the city many difficult questions about vulnerability of water supply. And then when we were having wildfires, a lot about our wildfire mitigation plan. So definitely the rating agencies are doing good work around this. I think investors could do a lot more. Insurers could do a lot more as well in requiring this kind of information, which would basically force the utilities, the cities, the issuers to get this information and make it public. There are tools emerging, and I'll show you on the next slide some examples, but one of them is developed by Oxford University. It's called the GRI Risk Viewer. It's an open source platform. You would type in an address, and it'll show you all kinds of climate risks and associated infrastructure that could be impacted by various climate shocks. So very interesting tool. I think it would be super helpful in any kind of planner or even investor rating agency to look at this kind of data when making their evaluations. Professor Jan Whittington in the University of Washington, she has a very interesting tool for really cities to make sure that their capital plans are screened against their climate goals. So it looks at carbon emissions, but then also physical climate risks. So it looks at flooding and heat shocks and seismic risk, all of these things. I know seismic is yet another risk, but so very interesting work happening by those two groups. I think, and this is something we developed when I was in San Francisco, is we would report in our green bond impact reports, we listed all of the project impacts and benefits aligned with the UN SDGs, and the UN SDGs do a good job of covering resilience impacts. So that's I think a very good practice, and investors and rating agencies really responded well to that. I know Agua, John's team, is also working on a way to quantify the water resilience benefits. I know, it would be amazing if we had a better handle on the value of resilience benefits on credit. That's really kind of where, if we could get that information, I think that would really drive a lot of very good investment. And then I just have this resilience bond concept that's being explored by UNCDF and was developed by Shalini Vachala, if she's on the webinar. Hello. Very interesting idea, kind of modeled after the ESCO model, that if you have an insured asset, you could get your premium sort of provided to you in advance so that you can actually build the mitigation or the adaptation infrastructure, like a seawall, for example, and that would be repaid through insurance premiums that you would have otherwise had to make. So very interesting idea. These are just some screenshots of the tools I was referring to. On the left is the GRI risk viewer. I just typed in Mumbai and river flooding and coastal flooding. You obviously need a lot more granularity if you're going to be doing a project planning, but this will give you an idea. And I believe you can contact them to get higher resolution files. And then on the right, this is a file from work that Professor Jan Whittington did in San Francisco when I was there, a pilot looking at some of our projects, and this is showing flooding in the city. And there's another layer that shows our infrastructure sort of overlaid and which assets are most vulnerable. And then this is very useful when it comes to project planning, of course. And what ideally we could do is when we're issuing a bond or seeking finance, we would screen our projects against this data, and as a demonstration that yes, we've screened our projects, we know there are risks in the city or in the area, and we've addressed it by elevating the asset or moving the asset, that kind of thing. Climate Bonds Initiative is also now very focused on resilience. For those of you that know climate bonds, we've been around many years, and we have taxonomies for 23 different sectors. So water, housing, transit, many different sectors, and they have mostly up till now focused on mitigation. But the realization is now that climate impacts are here, so we need to be shifting as well to include resilience. So this was launched last year at Climate Week, and the goal is to provide a framework for issuers and investors on standards. So there's to help grow this market, to help create demand for resilience, investments in resilience. And as I said, I think this is very, very relevant to local governments and water utilities. So just in closing, I think it's just super critical to both measure and reflect the value of resilience. We need to be doing that a lot more. Resilience just logically, clearly reduces the vulnerability of climate shocks. Its benefits are measurable. We need to develop the tools to better be able to do this. This isn't a political issue at all. There's real calculations we can do to assess both the benefit and or the risk. And then collaboration among stakeholders, I think, could be very helpful, and this would include the ones I've mentioned and and others, but it's issuers, rating agencies, investors, insurers coming together, establishing criteria and standards that we can all agree on, and I think that would be very helpful to create this change. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Mike. Another great talk, and also I think like a great complement to Ram's keynote as well. It's interesting. I would like to just say how passively clever we were in pairing those two keynotes. I think that they blend together in very interesting, useful ways. I love how you really dive into the details about how we like really try to construct the kind of resilience as a program and an investment strategy, and also some of the real challenges around it, like how do we measure resilience, and know if we're moving towards it or away from it, especially when we're trying to think about in a larger investment strategy, or we're trying to think about uh, uh, the kind of operational program that a sovereign entity is trying to work on. Maybe like a quick question for you is, and I think this is implicit in your comments. I'm really mindful that we're using most developed country examples largely in our references here, and I think the the reason for that is not necessarily because we're worried about LA per se. LA is a rich city in a rich state in a rich country, and in the end, LA is probably going to be fine. Um, it's really I mean, you showed Mumbai, which has a different order of challenges with it. And if we were thinking about like a city in Mozambique, if we were thinking about a city in Colombia, then we might be thinking about maybe even more additional challenges. Can you reflect just for a moment on maybe how some of these issues might play out in that context?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, and maybe Claudia and others would have comments on this, but um, it is the reality that the countries in the world that maybe had nothing to do with this climate crisis are the one are perhaps most at risk now, and are being expected to pay commercial rates, commercial borrowing costs to finance these infrastructure projects, and that for one, they cannot pay, they cannot afford to do that. And so this is a huge challenge. And one of the things I'm kind of most excited about in a way is trying to find uh, alternative sources of funding for projects, or ways we can fund projects at a very low cost. Um, I shouldn't, yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem and quite concerning. Um, I'll let others comment on that one too. I mean, there are like bright spots, there's like what if you can find like a beverage company to partner and help make a watershed more resilient, or things like that are public-private partnerships, which I've now fully embraced. I think they're critical to help cities, especially in those regions, invest in critical infrastructure. Yeah.
Excellent. I'd like to now turn to the larger panel, and this is where uh, we'll end the webinar as a whole. I am going to introduce the panel moderator, and then he will in turn introduce the two members of the webinar, and same time that we bring back Ram and Mike. Mario Lutz Pedersen is the panel moderator. We're very honored and excited to have him as our moderator. He's a senior policy officer for water and circular economy at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, responsible for the climate-water interface and international processes related to water and the circular economy. He's a political scientist by training with a focus on international relations, and has worked in the implementation of development cooperation projects with the German Organization for International Cooperation, GIZ, the Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources, BEGAR, and the Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, BFR, as well as the CGI Center, WorldFish. The floor is yours, Mario. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and hello from Germany, cold Germany, into the round. Good morning, good afternoon to all the world. And I'm very happy to be at this seminar, and I think I can echo what you've said, John. Thank you to Ram and to Mike for this great opening on the interface of credit system, water resilience, and climate risks. And I'm happy to welcome you now back on the panel. And I think you've given some thought for the discussions. And I'm very happy to also now welcome Claudia Sedoff and Carrie Wing on our panel. Claudia is a former executive manager, director of CGIAR, the world's largest non-for-profit partnership of international food, land, and water systems research institutes. And she was director of the International Water Management Institute and served 25 years at the World Bank, holding a variety of positions, including lead economist, global lead for water security and water resources management. So we are very happy to have your expertise on the panel, Claudia. And I would like also to welcome Carrie Wing. Carrie is a managing principal at Brown and Caldwell and works on municipal water infrastructure. And Carrie collaborates with utilities across the United States to redefine their approach to risk, enhance system reliability, and strengthen resilience. And her efforts include a pivotal role, for example, in establishing the US Water Alliance Net Zero Community of Practice. And she also served the EPA Climate Finance Working Groups. So happy to have you both on board. And before diving deep into the discussion now, I would like to welcome the audience as well to post their questions in the chat. So Q&A is open, and we will try to include your question and comments as best as we can. So Carrie, let me start with you. We're happy to have you and your expertise on working with municipalities across the states on board. And I'd like to start asking you in your work with the utilities, how have you considered any notable trends or changes in the climate financing landscape when we are looking at bonds and credit ratings?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, there are a lot of changes. I think LA is exemplifying what changes utilities are feeling in terms of expectations of them to start. What's reasonable to ask of a water utility to have hydrants that could put out a house fire or a block, or is the expectation now to be able to put out an entire forest fire, or a huge swath of the city? And so when we talk about relating to credit analysts and investors, bond buyers, insurers, we really need to start with that common understanding of what is exposure, what are best practices. And I think that water utilities can probably get out of our shell a little bit and engage and really elevate the understanding of credit analysts and investors, insurers, about wastewater and water infrastructure and how critical it is as a really a community critical institution. So, Mike Brown and I did work at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission together. We hosted investor tours. We walked ratings analysts around the plant, discussed our aging infrastructure. It wasn't a secret that we were embarrassed about. Instead, you had operators that were finding workarounds for decades because of underinvestment, and it was time to really change that narrative. That water is important; it should be valued, and that there are ways to develop these feedback loops with the financial sector, so that we can help identify blind spots and really better communicate what we're doing right. That story is not hitting the front pages of newspapers as much, because we tend to take for granted that we can turn on the tap and get clean water. and flush the toilet. And so it's time to engage.
Great, Sari. Thank you, Carrie, for putting a spotlight on the utilities and making the sharing and common understanding of best practice towards resilience a point here. I think this is important when talking to investors. And just one follow-up question would be if we look to see at the evolution from individual drivers looking at risks towards a more systems level approach in the water sector when approaching risk. What is your view on that? How can we encourage this holistic view of risk, and how could credit rating systems support this thinking? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, when we think about best practices, systems wide, um, utilities that better manage risk, they know their critical control points. They know where in their system they can accept failure, and that system will still provide reliable service after an earthquake, after an acute event. They'll know what critical control points were built for a stable climate that no longer exists. And that those critical control points now need to evolve and be invested in to handle a very dynamic climate with a frequency and intensity of weather, drought, wildfire, and then I'd also say that reciprocity agreements are a systems-wide indicator of resilience. Agreements with other agencies, getting first responders on your plant. Again, giving the tours to fire departments so that they know where the chemicals are stored, where the hazards are, while everything's calm. And so that there's a common familiarity, and then agreements with between cities to share trucks, staff, chemicals, because you may not have those supply chains for days, weeks, or months to come. There are a lot of opportunities for improvement, but really you hit it on the head that we have to start evolving our sense of managing risk from the siloed approach of health and safety is over here and exposure is over there, to a really more holistic and systematic approach to risk, which means you ask different questions.
Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, asking the right questions is key, I think. And thanks for having these comments on indicators of resilience and how important they are in communal infrastructure management and dealing with the risk that climate change is bringing with it. Thank you very much for this introduction. And I'd be happy to have Claudia now to join us in the discussion. You, as I presented, you have a distinguished career in international cooperation, having got to know different projects in financing and implementation of development cooperation. And I just would like to give you some insights on when looking at your different projects and positions. How did you experience the development of climate risk assessment in the sector in the last years, especially when looking now that climate change, extreme weather events are multiplying?
Well, thank you, Mario, and a huge thanks to Ram and Mike for the excellent presentations. You know, it's a really interesting way of posing the question about how our thinking has changed over the last 20 years or so as the world has tried to get their head around climate. And I think it's been really interesting in the water sector. I think back, and very initially, there was actually a lot of resistance in the water community that I was part of to really embracing issues around climate change. Ironically, the thinking was, We do water management. We do variability. We do the unexpected. This is what water managers do. We work with an amplitude of uncertainty, particularly in Africa, in the intercontinental convergence zones, etc. And climate change is just a small increment of uncertainty on top of that. It was quite interesting that that was the first perception in the water community. And there was actually a lot of resistance to shifting focus into a much more climate change focused space from this is just good water resources management. And this is something we've spent decades working on anyway. So we're actually kind of a little slow to the party, I'm afraid, as a water community, a little maybe overconfident. And then, frankly, we went into our silos on water, right? Because in water, anyway, in the World Bank and the multilaterals, there was always a big divide between the water supply and sanitation people who had human basic needs at heart, and that's where a lot of the funding and interest and visibility was, and the water resources managers, who were the more fuzzy thinking, earthy, crunchy environment folks. And so the water resources side, we're really looking more in the early stages at climate. But the specific sectors that are the water users, water supply, sanitation, agriculture, transport, power, we're thinking very monodimensionally and again, very incrementally. Okay, we've always dealt with variability. Let's add X% to that, and we'll design our infrastructure with a little bit of X% more variability and storage into it. And so what's been interesting there is a move toward exactly what Carrie was just speaking about, was this recognition that we have to look much more in a water resources frame, much more in a systemic, holistic space that had often been shunted in the international community into that space of long-term environmental, large-scale problems and away from actions we can take now in these water-using sectors to make us more resilient. So it's taken, I think, longer than it should have for the international community to come to really promoting water at the heart of climate adaptation. I think part of that is our fault, and part of it is this sense that water is just too complicated. It's everywhere. There's no answer to it, singular. We've all been there. And therefore, it's put off into somewhere in the medium term and not dealt with immediately. But I do feel there is a shift that is starting maybe just in the last couple of years, not just carbon, water, right? Carbon is to mitigation as water is to adaptation, and we need to move mitigation to adaptation, and water needs to be much more at the heart of these issues. But I'm sorry to go on, but I think the last point that Mike brought up about the need to address the equity and justice concerns around addressing climate adaptation in the vulnerable countries that were not real contributors to the problem has also been very much at the heart of the conversations in the international community where I've been as well. So the IMF has just recently come out with some very clear numbers that developing countries suffer disproportionately from climate impact. And they suffer disproportionately because they are less able, both physically, that's where they are, whether that's cause or effect, but also because they don't have the capacity to mitigate the climate risks. So in this particular context, where we're talking about credit ratings that will then diminish the sovereign credit ratings of these countries, this is really piling on the punishment, right? These countries are suffering disproportionately from climate change, to which they contributed very little. Now these downgrades of sovereign credit make everything they try to do in the climate sector and outside the climate sector more expensive, which will continue to sort of deny or delay their efforts to build that capacity to manage those climate risks. So it's really a very vicious circle with very regressive equity implications about, how hard do we push these countries to invest? And the credit rating tools are great at identifying what needs to be done and trying to incentivize action. But at the same time, it's a bit of a blunt instrument that will fall disproportionately on many of the countries that have the least capacity, that contributed the least, and in some ways hobble their efforts to invest in the sorts of capacities and strengthening that they need to manage this climate risk. So a fundamental issue in the international community is, how do we find that balance? How do we acknowledge climate risks? How do we signal that they must be addressed? But how do we do this without seriously disincentivizing all investment to those extraordinarily vulnerable countries? And I was struck as well by a slide that Ram just put up, specifically saying that impact was being seen on the credit ratings of emerging local governments. Those are the specific communities that are so vulnerable. How do we incentivize and support them without making them uninvestable when they're actually exactly the people that we are trying to support with all these tools that are being developed right now?
Thank you, Claudia, for this interesting input. On the one hand, on the development of the climate risks in your career, and saying the water sector is late, but better late than never, to say now that now climate adaptation and climate risk play a much broader role, as I understood you. And on your second point, I think we can just directly get Mike and Ram into the discussion. You said that how do we find the balance to not disincentivize investment into poorer countries, but still investing into climate? And I think this is that's just a great question on sovereign credit systems that I would directly hand forward to Mike and Ram. Would you be able to jump in here and say how can we balance the investment and not disrupt countries from the market?
I mean, I could quickly go. I mean, Claudia, I get your point. I guess back to how I started my presentation is, we fundamentally look at credit. And what does that mean? That it really focuses on whether the investor is getting their money back. So probably a default. So it's in the niche what we work with and we're on, it's really that is the end point. And there's a lot of taxonomies, there's a lot of different ways that we look at risks, but for us that is the number one risk, and that's our essentially our North Star where we go for. But that's not to say we understand that these are risks. And again, as I mentioned earlier, water has definitely gone from something which has been in the outskirts to something which is a lot more focused on this. And I can't really give a more holistic answer to that because what I focus is on credit, and I'm sure you can understand, Claudia. So yeah, but like I said, there's a lot more focus on water than maybe 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for this insight, Ram. And I'd ask Mike to come in on Claudia's comment, like to get incentives on climate investment, but also looking at the most vulnerable communities. How can we balance these two factors? Do you have a response on Claudia's comment here?
I'll say that there are some. So my focus is local government finance, and I think there are some bright spots with local government finance. For example, India has a pretty robust municipal bond market, and they're embracing green bonds as well. And a lot of the projects are water for the water sector. So I think water utilities including water utilities are great sort of low-hanging fruit because they generally will have revenues that can be used to pay back the debt service for the funding. So I think there are opportunities there. Mexico, the states in Mexico can also issue bonds. Utilities in Brazil. So there are some very good examples, and there's countries in Southeast Asia that a lot of them are looking very closely at municipal bonds. So I think there's movement towards it in terms of the cost of debt. There are some interesting innovations, blended finance, things like that. I don't know if it's at scale enough yet. to really make a big difference. But countries that can borrow, or cities within countries that can borrow, like in India and Mexico, they are doing it. Um, and they might be sort of at the leaders in this space. But the cost of borrowing is a super difficult problem right now.
Mhm. Thank you, Mike, on giving some specific country examples and also elaborating on the cost of borrowing and cost of debt. And with that, I think we can already open a Q&A session now. We're running quick in time, but I think we have some very nice questions from the audience. And I'll start with the first one, and then we can see who can best answer it. Like one attendee is asking, what is the best framework to analyze a water utility under ESG criteria in terms of water management? And this might be a question for Carrie, maybe, as it is directed at water utilities. So what is the
Sure.
best framework to analyze the water utility under ESG criteria in terms of water management?
Well, I think the best framework would probably be the framework, which is the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It really does an excellent job of defining governance. And what TCFD does very, very well is it helps any entity, especially water utilities, communicate why they're deserving of trust. And really, that's the currency that we're talking about with credit ratings. Why should an investor trust an entity with their dollars? So, when you go by, let's say, TCFD for proactive disclosure, what you're enabling water utilities to do, or those that are scrutinizing them, is these utilities to get their documentation organized, to stay ahead of the narrative, to demonstrate that they're responsible and that their actions are defensible, rather than appearing unprepared or reactive. Because those utilities that can articulate clear and concise narrative, they're going to enhance trust with these financial stakeholders, but also their communities. On the other hand, if you've got a utility with strong governance, but they may struggle to retain that trust if they can't effectively convey responsible leadership. And when trust and confidence erode, the consequences can be quite severe, financially, reputationally, even in terms of legal, regulatory compliance. And that's a tragedy on top of a tragedy, like we're seeing in LA. To Claudia's point of piling on the punishment. So I'd say the TCFD is probably the best framework, and that it's one of those that you can take in bite-sized portions.
Okay, thank you, Carrie, on letting us know your opinion on why investors should trust an entity. And I summarize that strong leadership, governance, documentation, transparency are just some of the keywords that are important here. And looking at the time, I think we come already to one of our last questions. It's a longer one. I'll read it through. It is generally accepted that most climate change impact will manifest largely through water-related stress. We also probably all agree that not many places in the world have water and water services provided at the true economic cost. Can we talk of realistically addressing and achieving some form of resilience while the true cost of water is largely not apparent the world over? And I would just open the panel, so let me know who would like to give a comment here on the question on how can we give a true cost to water related risks from an economic sense, and that really covers also the main title of the webinar series here. So yeah, I'll see if if anyone from the panel reacts, who would like to answer this one?
I'm happy to start just to get it going. It's one of those questions where what's measured is what's managed. In parts of the U.S., which I'm most familiar with, there are entire groups of states that share one aquifer. It's been a plentiful aquifer. And so there aren't even meters attached to water consumption. Very difficult to understand the value or begin to articulate the value when we're not really measuring consumption or impacts of consumption to the volumes of that resource. So it may start with a better understanding of the rate at which we're depleting that resource. And I would, turning it over to the rest of the panel, say that whatever system we develop for appreciating the value of water just has to take into account that water should be considered a right, and that there should be adequate access to clean water for everyone, regardless of affordability, and that can be incorporated into the blueprint.
Thank you, Carrie, on answering this question on the economic value on water and putting up the human right on access to water here again in the focus. I think this is a very important topic, and also already coming close to a closing remark. So I'll have a look at the panel if there are any last quick reactions to the last questions. Otherwise, I'd already like to thank you very much for this very great input to the different perspectives from credit rating systems towards economic resilience, looking at municipalities, looking at utilities, and looking at international cooperation projects that just gave us very great ideas. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Miriam Seaman, who will give us our closing remarks. And Miriam is a senior policy advisor for the global program Water Security for Resilient Development and the sector program Water and Sanitation Policy, Innovation for Resilience at the Organization for International Cooperation in Bonn. And she has over 15 years of working experience in a wide issues of areas from governance to natural resource management. She holds a PhD from the University of Hamburg and graduated from Portsmouth in the UK. And with that, Miriam, I hand the word over to you for closing this great webinar.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thanks a lot for this interesting discussion, and especially to the speakers, panelists, and the moderator, you, Mario, for your brilliant inputs. Well, in today's webinar, several important issues have been raised regarding the challenge that climate change is creating new risk and complication for investments, both in the water sector, but also related to other sectors. And I would, like to try to summarize some of the key takeaways from your input today. I think after today, it becomes very clear and even more evident that climate change impacts remain relatively new perspective for how we evaluate, score, and compare investments. We heard in the presentation that water stress and hazards can increase risk of investments, while proper water management can also elevate risks. On the one hand, we also heard that credit rating agencies started incorporating these risks within their analysis, and that there's an increased focus on water management consideration, which is brilliant. But on the other hand, we also heard that current credit assessments are still very focused on financial performance and don't adequately account for vulnerability to climate. And additional key takeaway is that there's a huge challenge to quantify and measure resilience benefits, since unlike mitigation, resilience metrics lack standardization, and that there's a need of demonstrating resilience and to be really transparent for the risks, with the risks. We also heard some examples of financial risks of inaction with some impressive numbers, which were very interesting. And maybe to sum up, I think we can observe that globally there's a push for low carbon, climate resilient development to meet mitigation and adaptation goals, and also to ensure investments that provide returns even in a changing climate. And that based on the scale of global bond markets, even the modest shift in rating analysis and scoring will have a tremendous impact on the direction of climate finance, and that governments and major issuers are taking note of this evolution. And it's really exciting to see where things are headed in the future. Maybe my last takeaway, which I personally liked a lot, and I will cite you, Mike Brown, is that resilience reduces vulnerability to climate shocks, and its benefits are measurable, and that this is not political. I think this is a very strong takeaway. Finally, I would like to highlight again that this webinar is part of an ongoing series organized by the Water Resilience for Economic Resilience Initiative, and that we encourage everyone here to sign up for the mailing list and join the next installment in central banks and macroeconomic policy. Links for more information and other resources can be found on the website, but also using the QR code. And again, I'd like to thank the participants and everyone who made this webinar possible. A big round of applause for the speakers, the moderator, and panelists, as well as AGWA and the Water Resilience for Economic Resilience Initiative for organizing this really interesting webinar. Thanks to all of you, and I wish you all a wonderful day.